I'm Webb Newton, and this is Self-Tech. This video is for mental health professionals who are curious about restoration therapy. This is why I've asked Dr. Terry Hargrave to give you an overview of this very inclusive model. Terry is the Evelyn and Frank Fried Professor of Marriage and Family Therapy, Department of Marriage and Family Therapy at Fuller Theological Seminary. He is a prolific author around a variety of topics ranging from grief, taking care of our elderly parents, forgiveness, and marriage and family. He is the primary developer of restoration therapy, which is the foundation of the Self-Tech application. So without further ado, here is Dr. Terry Hargrave. So Terry, thanks for joining me. And
my pleasure.
I appreciate actually all the work you've done, and it's great to be a part of it. For those therapists that professionals, whether it be social workers, psychologists, licensed marriage and family therapists, licensed professional counselors, they've been introduced to lots of theories and models throughout their life, their professional life. Guide us through what exactly caused you to move to this model and what makes it distinct from the other models out there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the way that I would answer is that in the current kind of milieu of psychology right now, there are three things that have been really cooking the last 20 years that we that are in the helping professions need to pay attention to. The first one is the overwhelming evidence of that attachment theory is actually in the right ballpark, okay? That the idea that our early attachment to relationships are really essential in terms of game changing the way that we perceive future relationships, but also how we perceive ourselves in that framework. So attachment theory is sort of the dominant force in terms of explaining why we are the way we are. The second thing is, and this came along really in really a profound way in the last 15 years, is the importance of emotional regulation. What we know is that we're not bad all the time. We're just bad when we're bad. And when are we bad? Well, we know that now psychologically is that it happens when we get emotionally dysregulated. So in the layman's terms, when we get our buttons pushed, or when we get lit up in terms, or where we get activated, you know, there are a lot of ways to say it. But the idea is that that's when we become the most volatile, the most profoundly prone to acting out in destructive ways that cause our relationships to go awry. The third thing that is really important to note over the last 30 years is the information on mindfulness, that what we know about the brain is that we're not just genetically programmed to act a certain way. There are variations, and even well into our 70s, 80s, and 90s, we are able to change the way that the brain reacts to different things. But it does take mindful attention. It takes curiosity to be able to find out things, and it takes insight to say, this is what we need to do. And most importantly, it takes practice, which is a mindfulness strategy that it reoccurs over and over again. Well, what we'd say is that, so right now where we are in modern psychology, that if you don't have, if you're not paying attention to attachment, emotional regulation, and mindfulness, your theory is somewhat outdated. Well, you have a lot of theories that pay a lot of attention to attachment. You have a lot of theories that pay a lot of attention to mindfulness. Those would be the classic frameworks. More of a psychoanalytic to attachment perspective would pay attention to attachment. More of the cognitive behavioral frameworks that we've had in the traditional past have paid attention to mindful practice or change. But really, in today's society, you really have to pay attention to all three.
All three.
That's what I say. It separates restoration therapy from the pack in terms of a modern theory. You know, what I would tell you, Wib, is there's nothing new about restoration therapy. We use things from several different theories. And so a sense is we're just putting it together in a certain way. There's nothing new that we've discovered in particular. There's some discoveries in the way that we do things, but not, in other words, when people come to restoration therapy, they'll say, that's familiar from cognitive behavioral work, or, oh yeah, that's familiar from attachment work. Oh, I think that I've heard something about that in EFT. That's true. There's a sense that nothing's new. There's a sense, though, also in restoration therapy that everything is new that we do, because we put it together in such a way, in terms of an organized fashion, that the therapist can clearly understand where the client is with regards to their own attachment, their own process of emotional dysregulation, and therefore understanding how to get to emotional regulation, and then finally putting that together into a mindfulness practice where we can actually change. We often say this to people is that if the therapist can keep themselves from getting lost when they're working with clients, then you will see a dramatic change of your clients not getting lost into their emotions or their emotional dysregulation.
Terry, yeah. So, well, one of the things that I've noticed is, again, like you said, it is very integrative. Practically everything that I've ever been taught, I can use in some capacity. Is that Sharon?
We're in the middle. We're recording an interview, Sharon. Sorry.
Who was that?
Yeah, that was Sharon.
Was it Sharon? Okay, yeah. I didn't recognize her back there. Tell her I'll get her soon.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
Go ahead and ask your question again.
Well, it was one of the things that I've realized, again, it is very integrative. I think all the things that I've been taught, I can find a place for it in some time.
Right.
And also, I think one of the things that I've noticed, it is a very directive type of therapy, which is different than a lot of therapies.
One of the things that I think that is important that separates us again from the pack is the idea that the more we do restoration therapy, the more we're learning is that psychologically, we've always known that empathy between the therapist and the client is really a big plus, right? It makes the client feel relaxed, it connects them to the therapist, it makes them feel like the therapist is on their side. But here's what we've discovered also through restoration therapy. If you combine empathy with organization, in other words, if you really help the client understand, give them a methodology of understanding their attachment history, what dysregulates them, and be a little bit more directive and organized and structured through the therapy process, then that's a 1-2 punch that goes on in therapy. You're still going to do the empathetic connection with your client, but you're also going to organize them to produce the ability for the client to change.
And that helps the therapist, because one of the things that I've trained other therapists, they say, now I know where I am and I know where I'm going.
Exactly.
So that structure is so important.
If the therapist is not lost, then you dramatically increase your ability to keep the client from getting lost. If the therapist is lost, it's almost for sure that the client's going to be lost.
Yeah, that's for sure. So if you could flesh out for us, Terry, just the basic elements of restoration therapy for those professionals that are listening and are curious about this model.
Yeah, the organization would be very simply, if we follow that model, as saying there's an element that we do in restoration therapy that's very attachment based. There's an element that's very emotionally regulation. Excuse me, let me start over. When we're talking about, if we use the organization of what we just talked about in terms of understanding the client's history and how they came to be in terms of their identity and sense of safety. We can understand that from the attachment history. If we understand what it means for the client to be emotionally dysregulated, we would find a pattern in that framework. What tells us that the client doesn't get upset over 30 things. They get upset over centralized things that are challenging to their identity and sense of safety. And then there's this third aspect of mindfulness that we would take on the thing. That's where the potential to really change is. We try to leverage that process, doing those three things throughout therapy so that we understand. If we're looking toward the basic structure of what makes people tick, we're talking about relationships are really king. That's the attachment framework of understanding that we don't come into being by ourselves. We come into being in the context of relationship. It's a profound communal idea that we only understand ourselves in the give and take of relationships. Well, relationships teach me two things. First of all, the way that people love me teaches me something about my identity. In other words, my identity is trapped in my brain somewhere, in my sense of self. How do I get informed about my sense of self? Well, it's how you actually treat me in that way. If you treat me, for instance, and that you're really crazy about me, that you love me, you're excited about me, then I think, oh, I must be a unique individual because I have the ability that you love me like no one else loves, that you love me like no one else loves anybody else. That uniqueness makes me special. If you love me in such a way that's sacrificial, if you will really take care of my needs, even before you take care of your own needs, then that tells me, that communicates that I must be of great worth. Mm-hmm. And if you like to hang out with me, if you like to be around me, if you desire me, then it tells me, hey, I must belong to you. So we would say in RT, the easiest way to formulate or guide that narrative around attachment is, was this person loved in such a way where they, number one, felt like they were unique and special, number two, that they felt like they were indeed worthy, and three, that they felt like they really belonged. If you say yes to those things, that yeah, I feel all those things, then we would say you have a pretty healthy self-identity. But none of us has perfect identity because we weren't raised by perfect people, right? So
well, it's not only our family of origin that raises us either.
Absolutely. I mean, family and our original caregivers are big programmers of that identity, but also, and just as important, we have coaches, we have teachers, we have peers that have weighed in on our identity all the way through things. We have spouses, we have people that have told us who we are within the framework, and sometimes even events start shaping our identity. So yeah, there are different things that formulate who we are in terms of our own sense of self. The other thing that is just as essential, though, and our society loves to talk about love, right? It's a great thing, and certainly it's essential in formation of identity. But also restoration therapy pays attention to this, and you see this in the attachment literature, but it's not as clear, is that it's the importance of trustworthiness. Trustworthiness is the other relational component. Love and trustworthiness are really the things that make relationships work. Trustworthiness, when a relationship is consistent, it basically informs your sense of safety, that I am safe in this environment because this individual's around. We would look at things like, do the people that I rely on, are they predictable? Are they reliable in the way that they act toward me over and over again? Are they consistent in that care that they provide for me? Secondly, are they open? Do they Do they give themselves vulnerably and openly? No secrets. Family secrets have really made people feel unsafe for many years. And then the third element is this really basic sense of fairness. That's where you have a job to do in the relationship and I have a job to do in the relationship. And so it's this give and take in relationship that should be fair. This basic sense of balance or fairness in the give and take is what we call justice in relationships. And we talk a lot about justice in our day and time. But those are the elements that combine together for an individual to feel safe and secure in relationships. So if I have a healthy identity that comes from love, if I have a healthy sense of safety in relationships that comes from trustworthiness, then I'm a healthy individual. But like we said, not everybody grew up in a perfect situation. Even if you had great caregivers or you had a great school life or great peers, it wasn't perfect. So all of us have flaws in our sense of safety and our sense of identity.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you really do separate them out. I'll hear people say, well, I love them, but I don't trust them. Or some people say, I just don't love anybody anymore. But what you really dig down and find out is they do love them. It's just that they aren't trusting them right now. And so to have those differentiated is, I think, a really important aspect. And so in the model, Terry, I know that when you're able to kind of flush out those, what we call violations of love and trust in somebody, that you start beginning an understanding or even a cognitive map of what's really going on.
Yeah, exactly, Wib. You know, so often in therapy, we're used to following emotion. And we talk about emotion somewhat haphazardly, because what we end up talking about is a lot of times people's anger, or that the way they've been shamed, or the way that they can't face something, and the way that they create defense mechanisms, for lack of a better word. The reality is that when we're talking about basic identity and sense of safety, this is where people get lit up, or where they get their buttons pushed. In other words, where they start feeling wronged in relationship is when it feels like, you know, I don't know if you think I'm important or not, or you think I'm less important than yourself, or I can't really rely on you because when I ask you to do something for me, it just always comes back to me. So I show up for you over and over and over again, and you don't show up for me. You know, that's just like a button on your heart that says, whoa, you know, that's where we get emotionally dysregulated. That's why in restoration therapy, we concentrate so much on the identity and sense of safety, love and trustworthiness, because that's where the primary stuff really exists. That's where the primary emotion is. If we understand that, we understand, one, the person's story, two, where they get emotionally dysregulated, and then three, that creates the hope that we can somehow move the client to be able to change those things.
Yeah, restoration therapy really makes that distinction also between the primary emotion and the secondary emotion. And of course, the secondary emotion is more of the reaction or the coping that you're looking at.
Yeah, exactly. So what we call that, you know, if we were talking about really where I get my buttons pushed is when you insult my identity or my sense of safety. But once it gets insulted, once my button gets pushed that way, then I become reactive because I'm now emotionally dysregulated because I'm not sure who I am and I'm not sure if I'm safe, or both of those things at one time. Then I start moving to compensate. And we say basically there's 4 types of reactivity that people describe. One is that the first reactive measure is that if I don't feel loved or I'm not safe, I tend to blame other people. I get angry. I go after them. I think it's their fault. I become unreasonable. I become punishing. I become retaliatory. I I just simply refuse to look at my own stuff. It's all about how you are violating me. The opposite extreme of that is that I start shaming myself instead of blaming you. When you don't love me or I don't feel safe, I start blaming myself. Well, I really deserve people doing that to me because I'm not worth much, or I'm such an unpredictable guy. If I did things more right, I would be held in better regard. I can go on and on and on. Anger is not what you feel as much as what you do. In the same way, shame isn't as much what you feel, it's what you do to yourself. The same is true when you're talking about controlling behavior or escaping behavior. The third coping mechanism is that if I don't feel like I'm secure in who I am, or if I don't feel safe, I'll just control everything. I'll override relationships and say, if we're going to be in any kind of dynamic with one another, I will call the shots and I don't leave anything to you. And that we've all been in relationships where people are perfectionistic, they're kind of performative based, they're very highly judgmental, they're perfectionistic. That kind of behavior tells you, this is a controlling person. And then finally, the opposite extreme of that is sometimes it becomes so overwhelming. It feels so unsafe that I become reactive by just checking out, and escaping. At the light end of that, I might escape by actually just leaving or diverting my attention. I might withdraw. I might sleep too much or shop too much. When I get more serious about it, I might check out because I drink too much or drug too much. But at the most extreme level, I just emotionally go away. I really disassociate from the situation. But whether it's blame, shame, control, or escape, those things have in common that they're part of our fight, flight mechanism in our being. We do those things because we are emotionally dysregulated. And so the part of our brain that says, you must either become aggressive and fight this situation, or you must withdraw and hide out. Those type of truths of, of course, anger and control are those fight mechanisms. Shame and escape are those flight mechanisms. But they're all reactive. None of those reactive frameworks and emotions are actually constructive to the relationships. They are 100% destructive to other relationships.
Even though we can justify them and say that we're doing it for a right reason because we're hurting, but at the same time, when we hurt, then we hurt other people. It's not good for ourselves, nor is it good for the relationships.
Yeah, and you point out an important thing is that it's totally understandable why I become reactive, right? I have good reason to become reactive. But here's the part that, and in psychology, we'd have this tendency to say, because everybody does it, it's okay. Yeah. It's all right. Now, certainly in restoration therapy, we're not going to beat people up and become judgmental about them. But just because we understand why people react in the way that they do, it doesn't make it okay. I mean, these things are in essence destructive. And the way that we know that absolutely is because we were harmed by those same destructive mechanisms: anger, shame, control, escape, from people, important people, caregivers, friends, coaches, peers, teachers who treated us in that reactive way. And it damaged our sense of identity and sense of safety. So one way to do this is to understand what I've just got through going through in terms of understanding this sense of identity and sense of safety, and that those are primary emotions to people. And then they in turn react in a certain way share this framework with you in terms of just an illustration. What it tells us is that when people are feeling this violation of their identity or sense of safety, that's where they get their buttons pushed. That's what results in pain, emotional pain and stress for the individual. And like we discussed before, the brain, when it's under pain and stress, it is just like you were being threatened on a trail out in nature and seeing a rattlesnake or a big bear or something of that nature. When you feel pain and stress, it's going to trigger those coping mechanisms. So your identity and safety is where you start. But unfortunately, you feel unloved, unsafe, or both of those things. That leads you to these coping mechanisms of saying, I'm going to blame somebody or get angry at them. I'm going to shame myself. I'm going to try to control others in the relationship, or I'm going to escape the relationship. And these are words that we sometimes associate with that reactive framework, like a blamer can often be angry, rageful, sarcastic, retaliatory, threatening, grudge holding. A shamer can be depressed, negative, anxious, inconsolable, needy. They get isolated or pouty. Controllers are perfectionistic, they're defensive, demanding, they're critical, intellectualizing, lecturing. Escapers are irresponsible. They tend to numb out. They're avoidant, selfish. They're prone to withdrawing and sometimes being impulsive. See, if we understand that basic framework, then we can start really helping individuals kind of know what they do. Like they understand, oh, it's not you who makes me angry. It's that you just threatened something in my identity, or you threatened my sense of safety. And as a result, I feel this tendency to really get angry with you, or shame myself, or try to control the relationship, or try to escape. What we have really found out in restoration therapy is that when we get emotionally dysregulated, it tends to be over the same thing. We tend to get dysregulated where we've been injured before. And so therefore, most predictably, I don't get upset over 30 things. I get upset over things that threaten my identity and sense of safety. But here's what we know also, is that I've so practiced my reactions that when I get emotionally dysregulated, I usually do the same pattern over and over again. For instance, when I feel threatened in my identity, I can tell you my main reactive mechanism is shaming myself. I first and foremost shame myself. I beat up on myself, say, I didn't measure up. I didn't do what I was supposed to do. I'm an awful person. And so I start attacking my own identity, which makes it very, very difficult for me to console myself or have others console me. It's my reactivity. Those kinds of predictable moves are really what sets restoration therapy apart, is that if we can understand that pattern, then there's hope that we can change it.
Right. So you got this, again, that personal responsibility of I've got to change it. You have people that will go from relationship to relationship to relationship, and they never deal with what's causing their reactions in these relationships where they have to leave them. I forget who said it, but wherever you go, there you are. And so RT is basically emphasizing that personal responsibility. You do the work on you. Now, this is often considered, I love the words that you've used before, understanding the emotion and then the reactivity. First off, do you find that people are really aware what drives their behavior?
No, I think that mostly, particularly, we live in a society where there's a kind of a cultural liturgy that is current in our society, that relationships are built to meet my needs. In other words, it's other people's job to make me feel wanted. It's other people's job to make me feel safe.
Mm,
We sometimes leave out that framework that says, no. What it is that part of my maturity is that I need to grow to the point where I'm able to understand my own limitations in terms of my own identity, where my pain exists, and where I become destructive to others in relationships. Most often when we get upset, for instance, if we're blaming somebody, we think that they need to make it right. When we're shaming ourselves, we think we need somebody to tell us that they love us and care for us. That's all that I'm looking for. And unfortunately, psychology has kind of built itself around the idea of saying others should meet your own needs.
mm,
I think that's one of the things that restoration therapy is really distinctive on, is that we would be for the idea, instead of this thing called co-regulation, where you become responsible to form my identity and make me feel safe. It's my responsibility first and foremost to talk into my own identity and regulate myself and make sure I don't spill over into this reactivity where I check my own sense of safety and become empowered enough to be a good relational component. That way, you see, we switch over from the idea that relationships are about you meeting my need to the point where now, as a regulated individual, you and I are able to share with one another, talk about our own emotions, talk about our thoughts, talk about our own feelings, talk about our own cognitions. And that kind of coming together is really what we would define as intimacy. I mean, you can see how need meeting has some intimate components with it, but it's much more dynamic to have two healthy people that are actually sharing with one another. And as a result of their sharing, actually understand themselves a little better.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and to be able to regulate yourself regardless of what the other person is doing, again, is taking that personal responsibility. I'm not going to be, my identity or my safety is not necessarily going to be dependent on what the other person does or says. So
Yeah, there's a huge amount of difference. That's one of the things that separates us in the framework of restoration therapy, is it gives us the ability to really understand how we can take control
mm-hmm,
of something and self-regulate,
right.
and actually move ourselves to a much better situation. I was going to share with you one other framework in terms of saying there is a constructive alternative to what we do. For instance, if you think of it this way, I remember being challenged by one of the therapists that you and I know well. Oh, this was some 20 years ago. She said, it's so clear when you talk about this pain and this pattern that goes on, what we call the pain cycle,
right.
That's where the bad stuff comes from. But what about the good stuff? People aren't bad all the time. They're good sometimes. Why is it that some individuals, in other words, can we get to the point where we understand something more about where that good stuff comes from? And I think that's where we want to get to. I think that we want to believe that indeed we can get to that point. So what I want to share with you is this idea of where the good stuff comes from. Hold on for just a second. Let me pull that up.
Sure.
Yeah. All right.
Good.
Here you go. So the idea would be is that when we do get clear in our sense of love and trustworthiness and our own identity and sense of safety, that creates the opportunity that results in actually a sense of peacefulness. In other words, instead of it inflicting our midbrain with this pain message that says, oh my gosh, something is out of whack, we actually don't engage the midbrain. And the midbrain is kind of chilled out that way. And that leaves our prefrontal cortex free to make some choices. So it leaves us with an individual feeling of being loved and actually safe. And that opens up, instead of being reactive, that frees us up to make really constructive choices. For instance, instead of blaming somebody, I can actually move to nurture that relationship by being loving and encouraging and supporting and accepting of that other individual. Instead of being shaming of myself, I can actually value myself and say, there are great things about who I am. I can be humble, I can be respectful, I can be settled and hopeful about myself. Instead of being controlling of the relationship, then I can move into this idea of being balanced in this give and take relationship, where I can say, yep, it's your job to do certain things in the relationship, and it's my job to do certain things in the relationship. And it's okay for me to receive things from you, and it's okay for me to trust that you can take care of things in the relationship. And then finally, instead of being forced into this position of escaping, I can reasonably move toward and connect in this responsible, reliable, self-controlled fashion, where it really results in the connection between individuals. That's what we're really after in restoration therapy, is that we really want to help the individual understand their attachment perspective and understand the cycle that we call the pain cycle, so that they become insightful and organized around what has happened in their own reactivity when they get lit up or get their buttons pushed. But then that they can understand this element, that they can actually know the truth about themselves, that they can calm themselves and speak into their own identity, their own sense of safety. And that produces a sense of peace that enables them to move past reactivity into these terribly, terribly constructive things of nurture, self-value, the sense that they can be balanced in their give and take and truly connected in relationships.
Terry, you kind of went over the idea of finding the truth. I've heard you speak that what we call the pain cycle, that's kind of the sexy part of counseling, of doing therapy. And that could be extremely important to the client, as they all of a sudden become more aware. That insight can be powerful, but to help them now make that change, that shift from these negative thoughts and beliefs, these reactions that they have to them, to another way of acting. You've shared what the new behaviors would be, but to find that truth, that seems to be a different kind of journey for many.
It really is. You're pointing it out. In neuropsychological terms, we'd say the language of the pain cycle is prefrontal cortex work. It's easy because it's insightful, right? We're dealing with our forebrain in this way. We're saying our upstairs brain is making sense of our past behaviors, and we like that. We're kind of used to that in the psychological field. Mm-hmm. But the discovery of the new frontier, or the new country, if you will, is that to really change, this is where we start moving into emotional regulation and mindfulness strategies. is that it takes experience of actually practicing something different. You know, people are so practiced with their pain cycle that it happens with them without even thinking about it. It feels so natural to them. In fact, they don't even recognize sometimes that they've been violated in their identity or sense of safety because they've moved to their reactivity so fast. I'm so angry, or I'll never depend on anybody again. You know, some extreme reactivity like that. Where we're in this undiscovered country is really this ability to say, wait a minute, I know what's happening to me right now, and I need to repeat to myself the messages that I would want to hear for myself, as if I were parenting myself, if I were being a good caregiver of myself, instead of looking to somebody else, actually making the words come out of my mouth. Terry, you're important. You have everything you need in your gifts and talents to be able to measure up. And you don't have to be perfect. You're okay the way you are. You see, when I send myself that message to my identity, I'm starting to calm my own midbrain. I'm starting to say, it's here. When I recall the times where I've been able to be extraordinarily nurturing or extraordinarily encouraging or self-valuing, or where I've been really in a balanced relationship, those embodied memories where I actually did those things actually come back to me and said, you know, I felt differently. I could be empowered like that again to take those actions for myself. And as I practice those things more in my experience, I become more convinced and more familiar with the idea of self-regulation. It's a combination of really knowing the message that you want to give yourself about your identity and sense of safety, and then putting it into practice over and over again. That's the secret of emotional self-regulation and mindfulness strategies.
Yeah, and you use the word embodied as well. We may be aware of the Saturday Night Live skit where the guy looks in the mirror and says, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone people like me. And so
Stuart saves the world, right?
yeah. And so, but we're looking for something different, more than just words.
Right. When the embodiment, it's the experience of those things as they run deeper and deeper. You know, for instance, I can tell you, for instance, I can call something to your memory, like as saying, Wib, what it's like to smell a flower on a fresh summer's day, and you'd say, yeah. But if I got with you and said, Wib, I want you to go back to this time,
Right.
where you're on your parents' property as a man, and you got up before everybody else did, and you walked outside, and you felt the dew on the grass on your feet, and you came across this perfect flower. You remember what it smelled like? In other words, that's embodied memory. In other words, you would be able to capture this. The same thing is true as saying, you've gotten the message for a long time in your life that you didn't really measure up. You were just this big football player that really didn't have any idea about what was going on.
Hey, are you reading my mail, Terry?
I know you a little bit, yeah. But when I say these things, it's saying, Wib, there have been times where that you're that you've been a man of confidence, that you control your own body and your own emotions, that you stepped in right at the critical time, right at the critical moment to say what no one else would say and say what was really important. Tell me about that time.
Right.
And when you relate that, you see, you would be telling me something that was actually embodied with you. That makes you more authoritative on your own life. So it's a lot deeper than just saying, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. It's really going into this undiscovered country of your own ability to say, I am, in many ways, the captain of my own identity and sense of safety now. And not that you always were, because you were a little kid at one point and you were influenced by other people. We're just saying we want to tap into the ability of this empowered individuality that people possess to become all that they can be.
And again, I think this is another element that makes restoration therapy distinctive from others, is that we really are looking for more than just words. We're looking for that embodied truth that can then generate those newer behaviors, those new behaviors or desired behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. We're crossing the threshold a little bit into this idea of moving away from the idea of co-regulation, where the therapist would be the important person to be able to kind of parent the client into a different place, or even a relational framework where you meet my needs and I feel better as a result.
Right.
We're really growing up people into their own adulthood. We're positions where they're quite, where they operate much of their time. In other words, their best elements of when they give to other people, we just teach them how to give to themselves in a constructive way and to be empowered themselves, instead of believing these old harmful messages and becoming reactive to it. We're teaching them how to regulate themselves on these positive emotions where they're nurturing to others, and they learn how to be nurturing to themselves.
Yeah. So you've developed the pain cycle, you spend the time developing the peace cycle. Now it's just trying to have them get that more and more integrated to where it becomes second nature. And you've developed a strategy to do that.
Yeah. This is something we call the 4 steps. It's just a simple mindfulness strategy is all it is. Mindfulness in and of itself is not that profound. It has a profound effect, but it's not all that complicated. Basically what we do in the 4 steps is we teach people 4 things that they can do when they start feeling emotionally dysregulated. The first step is just say what I feel. Because when I'm emotionally dysregulated, I need to identify and recall to myself, oh yeah, this is familiar territory. I'm feeling unloved. I'm feeling unsafe. I'm feeling like I can't measure up. I'm feeling alone. Whatever that message is that has pushed the button, I need to make it overt by saying it out loud so I can hear it to myself, so my brain knows, wait, you're doing it right now. You're feeling that emotional dysregulation. The second step has to do with say what you normally do when you feel that way. In other words, when I say, oh, I feel unloved, or I feel unsafe, or I feel alone, or I feel like I can't measure up, what do I normally do? Because, you know, in the therapeutic process, we usually teach people their pain cycle. They are remarkably consistent in what they do. For instance, a lot of people that don't feel like they measure up, they try to perform their way out of dysregulation. They try to prove themselves by doing more. Or if I feel unloved, I become super, super sad and depressed because no one loves me. Or if I feel alone, I try to, retaliate by getting angry at somebody. We're pretty consistent in our pain cycle. So when I say what I feel, and then say what I normally do, I'm actually being honest with myself. I'm saying, getting angry at this point or shaming myself at this point is going to do no good. I've been through this cycle 10,000 times in my life, and I know where this will land.
Yeah, I can. People who say, I'm feeling worthless, so I think I'm going to shame myself. That all of a sudden it doesn't work. So
it's really difficult. It's really difficult to do the very thing that is destructive.
Right.
That's one of the great things then is, so the first step is I say what I feel. The second step is I say what I do. The third step is to say the truth about myself. In other words, what is the message that I want to give myself right at this critical point? Because I feel all those things. I feel alone. I feel unloved. I feel like I don't measure up. What is it that I want to say to myself? Where do I need to listen to my embodied, my empowered self? Right. And saying, this is what I know about you, Terry, or this is what I know about you. You are extraordinarily lovable. You don't have to measure up. You're able to do things on your own. And you may not do them perfectly, but you will find your way to what needs to be done. Yeah. Because that's what you've always done.
And those truths. Go ahead, Terry.
That kind of thing settles that emotional dysregulation because it recalls the embodied truth that you worked with in therapy.
And those truths are directly refuting or challenging those pains, those negative thoughts or perceptions that you have.
Yeah, that's one of the great things that we do in restoration therapy is we help. We don't just work with these global ideas like you're good enough, you're smart enough, and people like you. We really work with these very specific ideas. We know where our clients hurt, and we want to speak directly the counter message to that element of where the hurt is.
And then it is followed up with new behaviors, new action.
Yeah, and then that's the fourth step is saying, say what you want to do differently, and then we add sort of a parentheses and do it. Yeah. Because the reality is that I told you that when I feel emotionally dysregulated, I shame myself. I feel unloved or I feel like I'm not measuring up. I beat myself up. When I actually say, yeah, you're actually loved and you're perfectly equipped to do what's needed to be done, even though it may not be perfect, it'll be more than adequate. And so therefore, I'm going to do something differently. I'm going to step in, for instance, and connect with people. What I tend to do when I beat up myself is isolate. Well, I make myself connect. Mm-hmm. I actually go in and talk to my wife and say, I was feeling this way, but I'm talking to you because I'm trying to move myself to a different place. I'm actually, instead of trying to perform my way out of things, I'm actually saying, what is it that I can engage with others on to actually make this situation better? Is it something I need to just accept and say that didn't work out? Or is it something that we can work together to actually improve the situation? Right. Those situations kind of bind us together in a different way and start moving us toward reciprocal actions, which start reinforcing the very truth that we're saying to ourselves.
Well, I really appreciate this overall view for the professional. What else is you'd still like to address or talk about, Terry, for the professional who's curious or interested in this model?
The main thing that I think that you need to look at if you are considering restoration therapy is really threefold. I think that you would say, is there something that I want to do? Because most therapists are familiar with attachment theory. Is there something more that I want to do with attachment theory than just identifying my client's needs and what the emotions that they have? Is there some way that I want to empower them to do something different? I think that that's really an important element. The second thing is that really emotional regulation is the wave of the future. This concept of emotional regulation will dominate psychotherapy for the next decade. So we might as well jump on the bandwagon and get with it. And RT is one of those methodologies that takes emotional regulation seriously. The third thing that I'd say to therapists that are considering restoration therapy is that more and more we're going to hear about experiential mindfulness, embodied practices of mindfulness. This is the way out. If insight is terribly motivating in therapy, and we've spent maybe 125 years of our psychological history working on insight. The place where we're headed is an exciting place, just as exciting, where we actually practice skills into the being of people, an embodied mindfulness.
Thanks again to Dr. Hargrave for giving us this overview of restoration therapy. If you would like more information on restoration therapy, I encourage you to purchase the book entitled Restoration Therapy by Dr. Hargrave. If you're also interested in getting trained in the model, please visit the website restorationtherapytraining.com. A better self, a better world, Self-Tech.